again, thank you for joining today's session. Dena Prastos, you're the first waterfront architect. I don't know what that means, by the way. And we're going to spend some time talking about this. You are trailblazing a new category in the industry, waterfront architects. You established a company called Indigo River. It's a woman-owned transdisciplinary design firm focused on progressive waterfront architecture. Very excited to know what that means. You also focus on resiliency and climate adaptation. Apparently, you're one of the leading authorities in New York Harbor and beyond. You specialize in climate adaptation through waterfront solution. You're guiding and executing projects from ideation all the way to the final construction and operations. So you are an architect, a civil engineer, a futurist, a climate adaptation expert, an entrepreneur, and you are also a creative original. You seek to transform the built world at the water's edge. You know, there is an overlapping stage of design, technology, and nature. It drives you to increasingly, have progressive views and take on things, and especially in the design and architecture field that you specialize in. Thank you again for joining this session. I also learned that you grew up in Anchorage in Alaska. You're born and raised there, actually. So talk to me a little bit about that particular period of your life. How was it, and what got you out of Alaska into New Jersey, I guess, right?
Sure, absolutely. And first, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here and to chat with you. I did grow up in Anchorage, Alaska, and I graduated high school there. So all of my formative years were spent in Alaska in the wild. The summers, the TV would be unplugged. We'd go outside, we'd play. We had a stream in our backyard. So very in tune and in touch with nature. And I think that as a foreshadowing really did shape a lot of my outlook in terms of my career and the areas that I practice in now, especially being on the waterfront. When I was looking to go to college and study architecture, there were no colleges that offered architecture in the state of Alaska. And so it was a natural progression to look outside of the state. And one of my filters was I was an athletics scholar. And so I was able to get scholarship for athletics. I played Division I soccer. And so I filtered my search by Division I soccer programs and 5-year architecture programs. And the 5-year undergrad enables licensure for architecture. And so that was kind of my initial search, and that's how I first ended up in New Jersey, and now I live in New York, but very close to New Jersey, and my husband is from New Jersey, and so yeah, spent some time in the Northeast.
You still play soccer? I can't help but ask.
Not so much. I wish. My knees really had it. Division I athletics is rough, and my knees maybe 10 years after I continued play, and then kind of ramped down from there.
Oh, that's super interesting. I can't help it but ask because I played soccer. My kids play soccer as well. It's
awesome.
An interesting sport. I love soccer. It's just an interesting sport. And then you went into the engineering school?
Yeah, so I finished an undergrad in architecture, and I ended right around kind of change of the economy, 2007, 2008, and in part out of a self-awareness and wanting to boost my confidence in technical areas, I decided and very deliberately went into civil engineering for a master's program. And so I finished that shortly after my undergrad, kind of went full through on both. And then entering the workforce, similarly, I wanted to build my confidence in terms of the kind of practicalities of the construction industry. And I spent the first half dozen years of my career in the field with a heavy civil self-performed contractor before finally making my way back around through design engineering, marine engineering, back to architecture and architecture on the waterfront.
And I have to ask, which one do you prefer, architecture or engineering? Which one do you like more?
I'm an architect through and through. I'm a registered architect. I'm a practicing architect. I am very grateful for the experiences and education that I have as a background in engineering, but I use them really as a touchstone and departure point to be able to become a better designer and architect.
Does it help?
It does. And I think in my case, both having spent time working with contractors in the field, understanding the construction process, understanding some of the challenges, understanding the vocabulary, and having some empathy with the individuals in the field building things, as well as Similarly, an empathy for the engineers, kind of problem solving these designs that the architects put together. And so having that in the back of my head in the early stages of design has become very helpful.
Which one takes over? Because, when you're an architect, you're very visionary, you're very creative, you're driven by your vision, by your creativity part of your brain. But then your engineering kicks in and starts blocking you and stopping you. This is not possible. This is too complicated. This will take a lot of work. Which one conquers the other? How do you stop your engineering?
It's a balance. It's a balance, and it's an iterative process. So I'll sometimes maybe go down too far the road with the visionary architecture and kind of backpedal a little bit with the engineering. But it's for me and for the team that we've assembled, a very natural part of the process to kind of stop, reframe, reconsider from whether the logic of the engineer or the vision of the architect, and be able to move a project forward by looking at it in different ways.
So you have these two voices in your head.
Always.
Fighting all the time. All right. So you started Indigo River, and you apparently started something called Waterfront Architecture or designs. Or talk to us about Indigo River, and then what started first, the idea of Waterfront Architecture or Indigo River? What led to the other?
So my career path, I think, is atypical in that I am now an architect, but I haven't really or hardly worked on buildings. Architects are licensed to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public in the built environment. That doesn't mean only buildings. Most architects that you meet, the assumption is they work on buildings. They work on whether it's residential or commercial or retail spaces. I don't. I work almost exclusively on infrastructure and waterfront infrastructure at that. So the types of projects, and again, this is a function of my career and the types of projects that I was exposed to early in my career, and seeing the opportunity to have a practice that focuses on these typologies, kind of geophysical properties of infrastructure at the water's edge. The types of program and the types of projects that we work on include ferry landings, ferry terminals, port facilities, vertical bulkhead structures, seawall structures, park facilities that are on the water, pier facilities, marinas, recreational access. So there are a lot of different typologies that are found at the water's edge, some for recreation, some for, maritime commerce. But our practice focuses exclusively on this condition where land meets water, where nature meets man-made. And it is just by function, you mentioned early on, kind of our focus in climate adaptation work, just by function of being on the waterfront, it is a very vulnerable typology. We are every day dealing with sea level rise, with tide cycles, with storm surge, with flooding. And so just by function of having that in our day-to-day dealings, we're very comfortable working in larger scales of climate adaptation projects.
Where did the name come from, Indigo River?
Well, Indigo is my dog, and we live on the river, and it's kind of a love of a love. My dog loves the river. I love my dog. But it was intended as a temporary name, but it stuck, and it was well liked, and so we kept it.
That's a good name. That's a good name. Waterfront architecture. You started that?
I believe I'm the first to focus an entire practice solely on waterfront architecture, waterfront infrastructure from the designer's lens, not necessarily as an engineer. There are marine engineering firms, and that is different. That is problem solving. But for architects, they're generally seen as generalists. That architects do everything, residential and hospitals and whatever the different type of program is. And I do not. I focus solely through, climate adaptation lens of infrastructure.
What is climate adaptation, Dena? What do you mean by climate adaptation? How does that impact your design process?
Yeah, so when we look at codes that our work is, regulated by, oftentimes those codes are backwards looking and they're triggered by events. So there might be, it's happened with fire code that there's an incident, and so it kind of sparks the need to create a code so that, future health, safety, and welfare of occupants is protected. So with weather, with our climate, we're experiencing greater and greater extremes that historically have not been the case. And so when we talk about climate adaptation, it means not necessarily doing the minimum code work, but it means taking into consideration the future climate projections of what sea level rise will be, even though it's not fact, it's not something we've experienced. But as we're going through design process, we're aware of how quickly things are changing. And so we're taking into account those changes into our design, even though they're not necessarily embedded in code yet.
And how do they look? How does the future look as of today?
So types of interventions that we make oftentimes are, for example, if we're working on a seawall or a bulkhead, and we know sea level rise is projected to raise by 2 feet, we won't do the bare minimum. We'll make sure that, over the design life of the asset, whether it's a 50-year or 70-year, whatever the design life is, we look, again, the minimum of code might say it can stay at the exact height it's at, even though we've seen it and we've experienced it overtopping, but we might say, we're looking at the future science projections, and the extreme is 4 feet, the moderate is 1 foot. Let's look at 18 inches makes sense, it's viable, it's the return on investment to mitigate that risk is worthwhile for the client.
And how close is that projection? Is that for the next 10 years, 20 years?
It varies. So there are different authorities that have different projections, and they are often kind of course corrected. We've seen that what the projections were 10 years ago were not as harsh as they have been in reality, and so we are trending slightly more conservative in our assertions of what we should be preparing for in the future climate.
And you work on existing developments, like existing buildings out there that requires to be fortified against what the future could bring, or just new developments?
We do. I mean, we do both. We love doing new and having to kind of a blank canvas to build from, but we also more often than not are retrofitting existing structures. And I would say our one kind of departure from the water's edge working on buildings is when we're brought on specifically to help with flood mitigation techniques. And so that could be, deployable barriers or elevating different, utilities in parts of the facility, or changing how floodproofing system works, whether or not there was one, but implementing one. So yeah, we work in a number of different ways on buildings and on infrastructure with regard to the climate and flooding.
Which one do you enjoy more?
All together, all of it. It's all related.
So what consideration you take into play? How do you, I mean, I'm interested to know a little bit more. How does your design thought process changes when you're dealing with one of these waterfront developments and knowing with the projections that you were just talking about for the next 10 years or so? What differs, what changes there from a design and creative perspective?
So our kind of the parameters with which or through which we design, initially, we'll get a project, and I would say the typical architect receives a project, then they get a program and a site. Sometimes our services start far before that, where we'll help a client identify a site, or we'll select a site, or we'll help identify a program for a given site, make sure that it's optimized and it's the highest and best use. And so that aside, if a client does bring us, a site and a program, early stage due diligence to understand what the site constraints are, what the depth of water, what the contours are on the riverbed or seabed, whatever the body of water is, if there's a change in tide levels, kind of what the wave energy is, what the initial site constraints are. We just get a lay of the land, and then we look at what the risks are. We look at sea level rise, what the projections are, and we obviously we understand the code and the permitting implications kind of throughout all of our work. But the first thing that we do is we prepare this due diligence report where we'll sit with the owner to come up with the design criteria in terms of how long do we want the asset to last? Is it a 10-year, 50-year, 500-year? What are we designing for? And infrastructure generally has a longer time span than a typical development. And so learning what the desire is on behalf of the client, if they have a budget, or working with them to create a budget, understanding what the risks are of their decisions every step of the way. And then once that design criteria is established, then we really start the design process.
I mean, waterfront properties are usually prime properties, aren't they?
They are. They have. They certainly have an appeal, and they certainly, beyond, open view corridors and a connection with nature inherently, there's also, maritime economy, maritime use, short sea shipping has become more popular to have multimodal modes of transport. So there are different reasons why developers will look to develop on the water.
Is it really hard to marry the concept of a prime property, a waterfront prime property that is very, very exquisite and expensive to develop and maintain and run, and at the same time making sure that your design and your development takes into consideration the climate adaptation concept that you're just talking about?
I mean, for us, for our team, it's second nature. I would say it is specialty work because there are certainly different site constraints than found on a typical site. There are just different considerations that we're taking into account, dynamic forces at play that you don't necessarily experience on an upland site. And so I wouldn't say hard or easy, but it is certainly specialty work. And we, a little bit about our team. I'm certainly, I'm an architect. I'm licensed. I have a background in civil engineering, and I have a background in construction. But in terms of our team composition, broadly, we have engineers, architects, and planners. And even within engineering, they're not all necessarily civil engineers. We have coastal engineers. We have marine engineers. We have professional engineers that are divers that'll go underwater and inspect structures.
Oh.
We have geotechnical engineers that look at the soil composition, environmental engineers, so on. And within architects, we don't necessarily have building architects. Most of our architects have only ever worked on infrastructure. And we also have naval architects that focus on floating assets and vessels and interplay between, floating ferry landings. We have landscape architects. And then within planning, we certainly have, community engagement, stakeholder engagement specialists, but we also have climate adaptation specialists that are more focused on the scientific side. And so, again, for our team, I wouldn't categorize it as hard or easy necessarily, but it is a specialty skill set and specialty kind of process and way of thinking about the sites that we're working on. And yes, many of them are high profile sites because they are waterfront projects, high profile developments, but they take that kind of extra layer of thoroughness in that due diligence phase to come up with a realistic design criteria and then move through the design process.
Who has the upper hand, Dena, from all of these different engineers and then different, pretty much, contributors to the project, if I may say? Who has the upper hand? Who has the final say of how things are going to go? Is it the architect with?
No, I wouldn't say it would ever consistently be one entity. I think there are driving forces and considerations that will yield to each other, kind of a negotiation of different priorities. And oftentimes it's, the owner's input or the operator's input or the maintenance crew's input of, what the restraints are and constraints are that we then use to help shape our design in response to.
So it's not the developer?
No, I mean, a developer might have a budget that might say, we can't afford to do those things, or we're not willing to take the risk to develop in that way. And that poses one of many constraints that we, that's what designers do, is establish constraints and design within them.
So do waterfront properties require more effort than just a typical property other than, inland?
I mean, effort, broad word, but generally, yes. In terms of just the regulation alone, there is more regulation on waterfront projects than any other type of project because you're dealing with not only, a city agency or whether it's a village or a township or a city, a municipality, you're also dealing with state agencies. In our case, we deal with Department of Environmental Conservation or Environmental Protection. We deal with federal agencies as well, like the United States Army Corps of Engineers, if there's navigable waterways. We deal with NOAA. We deal with many different entities at many different scales. And so just the regulation of the waterfront alone is a heavier set to take on than a typical project that's landlocked upland.
Does it change a lot? Does it continue to change and develop or evolve this set of regulations for waterfront?
It does. And also I would say particularly during the pandemic, it raised or it sparked kind of a change in the way the regulators operated, if no other reason than, pre-pandemic, we would set, printed hard copies of the permit drawings out, and the forms would have, binders, thick stacks of binders with all the forms in them. Changing that to digital arguably is, more efficient, we think. But just in terms of the regulation and the regulators' process and how many projects they're able to review and in what capacity they review or kick back. And so that dynamic has shifted. And it is something that continues to evolve. The regulation alone, we look at, 1 year to the next, you could have the same criteria for a project, same site even, but the fish habitat might be doing something different. The spawning season might be different. And so the outcome of what that permit has, it could be an in-water work moratorium, is different just by function of, time moving on.